This is, as I'm sure you know, the capstone event of our 2-day conference, Crisis Code. And tonight we're going to be able to kind of stretch it out, kick off our shoes, and really get into the meat of this discussion. But let me just start with a show of hands. How many would identify yourselves as active in humanitarianism? How many of you are humanitarians? Okay, that's very good. And how many of you would you say come from cybersecurity or tech more generally? Anybody? A very strong showing. Thank you very much. How many of you come from policy or digital policy in particular? Anybody? Great. So the goal of these events have been to get all of you speaking together, and I think that's what we're going to be able to accomplish this evening. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin. I'm the head of science here at Swissnex and co-leading this initiative together with my colleague Martin. We just had 2 very full days of workshops happening here, bringing together people from cybersecurity, from humanitarian action, and from digital policy to discuss how to extend humanitarian protection to cyberspace. Today, we really went down to the core idea of crisis code, which is exploring the gap there is between established norms and policies and the rapidly evolving nature of warfare. We had the great honor of hosting the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, together with his colleague, Charlotte Lindsay-Curti, the director of information management at the ICRC, and Peter Maurer really summed up quite well the 2 days of this conference, saying, you know, these new technologies coming out of Silicon Valley will be used in humanitarian action, that's for sure. Humanitarian workers will, it might take some time for some of them, but they will figure out a way to use them to improve how they respond to the needs to the affected populations on the ground. What's actually more important maybe and more complicated is how to better protect these populations in the first place to reduce their needs and to avoid them to be affected by the crisis. And that's very much the idea of our conference and also our panel tonight. So now I would like to hand over the microphone to Swissnex San Francisco's CEO, Joya Deutscher.
I get 2? Double fisting microphones. Hello, everyone. I see a lot of faces that were here yesterday during the last 2 days, other faces I have seen around otherwise or that know Swissnex very well, so I'll keep it very brief. Just to remind those of you who forget and to the new ones, Swissnex is a platform that convenes different disciplines, different nations, different ways of thinking, different industries around themes and topics that are of importance to the future of us all, and always with a specific focus on the areas of education, science, technology, and the arts. As such, I think for us it has been a huge privilege to host this 2-day workshop, which is a continuation of an earlier initiative started by these 2 gentlemen, or the Consulate General in Swissnex, which was the Everyone a Humanitarian series that happened earlier this year, late last year and earlier this year.
With Andrina Boygard, whose birthday it is tonight. Thank you.
Happy birthday, Andrina. Little round of applause. And this has been a new and novel and a really, really interesting way for Swissnex to present itself as the so-called Little Geneva here in the San Francisco Bay Area. A neutral ground to discuss these kinds of important issues and to bring together exactly those different interdisciplinary point of views and to think about and ignite action to address those. So we truly hope that whatever was developed in terms of thinking in these 2 last days and will be further tonight will somehow find its way into action. We know this is a long process, but that over time we can see some true fruits from this, and of course many, many other discussions happening in many different institutions around the world at the same time around this issue. And with this, I will give the word to our Consul General, Chome. Thank you.
Thank you, Joya. I'm somehow responsible for the official part. Welcome at Switzerland at Pier 17. Also from my side, tonight's discussion and the Crisis Code Conference are part of the Swiss Touch campaign. And Swiss Touch is an initiative that brings together diverse stakeholders and fresh perspectives for conversations on innovation and pressing current issues. Each discussion takes place around this artisanal table, which was custom-made in the Alps. It has a number of digital touch features, which you are welcome to try out after discussion. Last night, I pointed out that we call this place a living lab for diplomacy. Crisis Code makes that slogan a reality. At this conference, technologists, humanitarians, NGOs, workers, entrepreneurs, and academic experts have come together to discuss humanitarian protection today and tomorrow. Yesterday, we confronted the new and developing risks and threats that face civilians and the most vulnerable among us. And today, we look at the road ahead. How can we develop and implement policy that effectively counters these threats? I do not have the answers, of course. For that, we turn to our distinguished panelists and our moderator, Alexa König. But one thing is certain: whatever conversations the future may hold for digital governance and humanitarianism, Geneva will play a key role. Geneva is not only the international city par excellence, housing countless NGOs and UN organizations, as the home of the Geneva Conventions, of which Switzerland is the proud custodian. It is also a symbol. Geneva stands for a permanent commitment to human rights and humanitarianism in times of peace and in times of war. Let me take this opportunity to recognize Dr. Jovan Kubaya here at the table of the Geneva Internet Platform. Thanks for being here, apart from all other of you, of course. With organizations like GIP, Geneva is bringing its legacy into the future. Now, Switzerland's purpose with this conference and with the Swiss Touch initiative is to bring people together for open conversations in a neutral forum. But seeing as we have you here, we would be remiss if we did not also share our official position on the subject at hand. To brief us on Switzerland's perspective on extending international humanitarian and human rights law to cyberspace, let me welcome my colleague Roland Portman, First Secretary at the Embassy in Washington and legal advisor of the Embassy. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll keep it very brief in order for the panelists afterwards to be able to give you their views. So for Switzerland, we're very much interested in this question of, well, we have an existing international legal framework on the one hand, developed over decennies and years of negotiations and so on. And on the other hand, we have this new issue of cyber threats and cyberspace in general as just a new reality. And the big question is how the existing legal framework that we have, how does it apply to cyberspace? We very strongly believe it does apply. The government of Switzerland very strongly believes that, but we're aware that there are issues of, well, how exactly does it apply? So there is certainly a need for clarification in our view, and we're thinking about as I said, this is something we as a government are following and thinking about as well. So thanks again, Swissnex, thanks the Consulate General, and thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward now to listening to the experts on this.
Thank you very much, Roland. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator tonight. We are really honored to have Alexa Koenig with us. She's the Executive Director of the UC Berkeley Human Rights Center. She's very well known for open source methods to support human rights advocacy and accountability. She's a technology advisor to the International Criminal Court and winner of multiple awards, including the MacArthur Award for Effective and Creative Institutions. So thank you very much, and wish you a great conversation tonight.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for that introduction, and also to the consulate and to the embassy for furthering the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening. Also, of course, to Swissnex for hosting this conversation. It is now my honor and privilege to have a chance to introduce the rest of our distinguished panel today. Immediately to my left is Eileen Donahoe from Stanford University. She is Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator, and of course is former US Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. Immediately to her left is Yovan Kerbelia, who is head of the Geneva Internet Platform, as was already mentioned, and founding director of the Diplo Foundation. Immediately to his left is Solange, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name, Gerna Utrie, from the University of Lausanne. She is an ICT risk management and cybersecurity expert. She is also with the Swiss UNESCO Commission. And then last but not least is Kirsten Vignard, Chief of Operations and Deputy to the Director for the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. She is an international security policy professional who has an expertise in the weaponization of increasingly autonomous technologies. Thank you all so much for being here. I was hoping we could open, since we have a number of guests from very different backgrounds and sectors. We've kind of listed your titles, but if you could talk a little bit about what you do in very concrete terms, in terms of this work at the intersection of policy and of humanitarian practice. I think that would be very helpful for setting the stage. Also, because tonight's conversation is very much focused on the future, if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen from your perspective in terms of the historical evolution of policy related to digital space. And Eileen, why don't we start with you?
Okay. That's not on. I'll take this one. Yep. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's a really interesting conversation. I'm sorry I was not able to be at the workshops. I'm sure a number of you participated and learned a lot, so many of you are probably ahead of those of us who are not here. But I will say that my work fits squarely in this space. So I have started this Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford. And the way I envisioned it was that it really sits at the intersection of two existing centers at Stanford. One was the Center for International Security and Cooperation, where I had been before I went to Geneva, and they have a very substantial program on cybersecurity. The other is the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And the way I see it, digital technology, digitization of society is really collapsing the distinction between those two realms. In many ways, we have seen that cybersecurity, the definition of a cybersecurity threat has changed dramatically. It used to be that we were thinking about simply hack on data that's proprietary, or we were worried about cyber to kinetic attacks on critical infrastructure. And what we've seen in this recent conversations, especially in the United States, but obviously also in Europe, is that there's a new type of cyber threat or digital threat, which is almost a hack on our discourse and our democratic processes. And not necessarily even a hack of a vote and a voting machine, but a hack of the discourse. And in many ways, that shows that there's been this weird collapse of this category of hard cybersecurity and how do you protect democracy. And so the center I work at sits right in that space. I think a lot about governance challenges that flow from digital technology. The three that I always tend to highlight are the trans-border nature and mode of operation of the internet and the digital flows of information is inherently challenging to an international order that's been built upon the concept of nation states defined by territorial boundaries. Doesn't mean it's made it obsolete by any stretch, but it is definitely challenging to that system. The other factor is digitization itself is, there are many upside benefits, but there are real downside risks to enduring values that we've had, especially from the international human rights law point of view. The right to privacy is obviously under threat because of digitization of everything. I would say our systemic cyber vulnerability and digital insecurity we're experiencing goes to the right to security in persons. And so extraterritorial reach, digitization, and then the third thing that's really challenging is privatization of governance, where big digital companies are in their own way effectively governing whether it's public spaces, public conversation on digital platforms, and also they own, operate, and secure all of the internet critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. And so they're controlling many dimensions of liberty and security that we did not originally think rested in the hands of the private sector. Last, I will mention, one of you in the opening brought up this subject of the question of how do we make sure that the existing international humanitarian law and the international human rights law frameworks are respected and adhered to in the digital context. And that is very much the frame we look at. Last, I'm going to mention, because you asked two really big questions. You asked, tell us about yourself, tell us about how you relate to the subject. Also, big picture sort of trajectory. I will just briefly mention, I was in Geneva in 2012. I was there for 4 years, but 2012, just 5 years ago, the first UN resolution on internet freedom was passed. And it was an exceedingly optimistic moment as it relates to the subject of digital technology and its relationships, especially to human rights. And there was this sense that, activists and dissidents were ahead of the curve and authoritarian governments would never catch up. And then we went to this phase where we saw, wait a minute, authoritarian governments are catching up very well, and they're actually using digital technology to squelch freedom of expression and to track and monitor dissidents. And now we're going to the next level where we're seeing even democratically inclined governments are so confused about the governance challenges that they are retreating from some of their enduring human rights commitments and their humanitarian law commitments. So I'm very concerned about that trajectory, and that's why this gathering is so valuable.
Good evening. I hope my voice will serve me. I have excellent ideas, but if my voice broke during the presentation, please have some understanding for me. What I'm doing in my daily work, I'm trying to reduce lost in translation between diplomatic and technical communities in Geneva. and to connect various dots between humanitarian health, human rights, and technological areas. And I can tell you, sometimes it is based on very simple use of core terminology, whether you use prefix cyber or digital or e or virtual signals to which community person belongs. Obviously, discussion gets much more sophisticated when you get into the real interest and values. Your question about what is the evolution and what is behind us and what is ahead of us could be answered by a shift towards a realpolitik, which we already heard from over the last 5 years. And realpolitik means that digital politics, which was initially driven by values, mainly in this city, in this area, values of openness, inclusiveness, sharing, enabling society, has been shifting towards interests. And this is a general tendency, and it is important for our discussion this evening because humanitarian field is based to the largest extent on values. What does it mean, interest? It means that governments are looking for to extend their power, and not only authoritarian governments, but increasingly democratic governments. Businesses are going, just taking care of their bottom line and profit. Therefore, the whole construct, which was based on values, started shaking, and this is one of the tendencies. In preparation for this event, when I was asked by a few colleagues what are the links between Geneva and Bay Area, one of the messages is that both places are based on the idea of innovation and trust in the power of the reason and human agency. But difference, and probably the reason why Bay Area may rely more and more on Geneva, is that Geneva experienced throughout the history, turbulent European history, clear examples of the limits of the innovation, especially when it goes against the core social and cultural values. Therefore, probably this is one important bridge which could create a synergies between Bay Area and Geneva Lake area. When we look for the future and what is going to happen ahead of us, I always like to quote the famous Churchill saying that further forward we would want to look, the further backward we should see. We should dig back to our common history, back to the ancient time, and some of the dilemmas that we are facing today related to human conditions are as old as humanity. Therefore, we should overcome definitely what is appearing as some sort of chrono-narcissism, an idea that everything is happening now and here. And some sort of humbleness with the history could be useful when we are facing definitely turbulent time in digital policy ahead of us. I managed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My main interest in cybersecurity is to try to find a way to work in a transdisciplinary approach because of technology, because of law, management, and ethics. And we were the first in Switzerland to develop around 2001 a master's degree in law, crime, and ICT security. So we were very well involved in this transdisciplinary approach. My second concern is about the way we put confidence into technologies that we don't master. We use technology, we don't understand the technology, and people who provide technologies can master these technologies, but we use technologies we cannot master. And the problem is becoming more and more important, and we need more and more technology to solve the problem. And we see that we can develop a lot of innovation based on data exploitation, but my main concern is to consider that providers have put some business models that put a problem on human value, for example, for privacy. And nobody wants to pay for privacy or for security. So since 15 and 20 years, we have developed a service, ICT technology, with no privacy and security. And now the cost of privacy and security is very high, and nobody wants to pay for it.
Thank you.
Good evening. I work at a think tank embedded in the UN system that deals with a range of international security issues. We're mandated to help governments think better and make better policies on international security issues. And that can be from conventional weapons, weapons of mass destruction, the weaponizations of science and technology, those sorts of things. Sure thing. Watch out or I'll use my mommy voice again. All right, so as far as the historical evolution goes, I think it's quite interesting. The issue of cybersecurity and international security, or ICTs is what they call it in the UN when we're talking about the international security part, was put on the agenda of the first committee of the General Assembly, the part that deals with peace and security issues, in 1999 by the Russian Federation. We've had a series of essentially closed-door negotiations since 2004 on these issues, with kind of breakthrough reports in 2013 recognizing the application of international law, and in 2015 with voluntary norms, 13 voluntary norms for responsible state behavior. And yet the 2017 negotiation collapsed without consensus. And it's really astounding to say in a 2-year period, we weren't even able to reaffirm what we agreed in 2015. And I think that says a lot about the global situation we're in and the insecurities that we face today in the cyber domain.
Thank you. Since you've all touched on where we've been and the trajectory we've been following, I was wondering if you could give us a concrete example from your practice that illustrates why we need some kind of digital policy in the first place in order to better protect vulnerable populations around the world. And I don't know if someone would like to volunteer to start.
Mine might be the most irrelevant, but I'll start with that. Because we heard a lot of very concrete applications during these last 2 days from the field of the humanitarian relief and humanitarian protection areas. I'm kind of looking at it from an eagle's eye perspective. So much of malicious cyber action that we see today does not rise to the level of what we consider an armed attack. And so if that's the case, what frameworks are we using to protect populations? What legal recourse and what normative frameworks are we engaged in if we are not in a war scenario, traditionally what we conceive of? And that creates new vulnerabilities because we really are struggling to say what protections do we have when we are not in a situation of armed conflict, and yet these malicious actions are happening.
Yes, and one of the problems is we use vulnerable product and hackable product, and there is no security at all, and cyber attacks are everywhere, anytime, and anybody can be involved in cyber attacks. So we are under the world of resilience, but it's very difficult, and we have to manage crisis, because crisis will come. And the huge problem is to detect the attack and to react to the attack. So my concern is about how we can react and prevent cyber attack against critical infrastructures that can put in danger human life.
Let me try again. One of the reasons why needed digital policies is that human relations in cyberspace, although we can discuss if cyberspace exists or not, like in a real space, require certain rules. And what is currently happening all over the world, courts are becoming to basically create a policy. European Court of Policy created the right to be forgotten. European Court of Justice is deciding on the Uber case, which may decide the future of the platform industry. Therefore, if there are no attempts to create a policy which will be balanced, taking into consideration business, security, human rights, and other interests, we'll have judges basically introducing new rules, which is happening already, in particular with the European Court of Justice, but also Canadian courts and other courts. It is not directly related to humanitarian field, but general principle is that if you have a void in the policy space, it is filled by, in this case, courts, because citizens and the companies have to exercise their right to justice. And when they go and they address the court cannot establish another working group, as it often happens in the UN. It has to rule on the concrete case. And if the policy is not proactive, if it is not balanced, inclusive, then we'll have the de facto policy established by courts.
Yes, please.
So I actually heard two questions in your question and some of these responses, which is, why do we need digital policy, and what is a concrete example, sort of? So the why, I think we've started to talk about, which is that there is conceptual confusion about how to apply existing values-based frameworks, whether it's international humanitarian law or international human rights law. And so that's not very concrete. That's a big conceptual challenge we face, and but it's urgent. And that's the why. And because there's so much confusion about how to apply, I think that confusion is kind of combining with fear that flows largely from all the cyber and digital vulnerabilities we're experiencing from digitization, and it's causing a retreat from our values, and even among democratically oriented and human rights-based governments. So that's the why. The what, the concrete example that comes to my mind is, a norm we could develop. It feels like in humanitarian contexts, this is the new humanitarianism piece of this conversation, that big data is being put on the table as something that is positive and can contribute to the services that are being provided in a humanitarian crisis. And that is no doubt true. But there are also serious downside risks to vulnerable populations that come from digital vulnerability and digitization of everything. Same is true in society, but it's certainly true of these vulnerable populations. And I think we need to make sure that in those contexts we have sort of a norm of do no harm. If not, and that we've got to, this is also a collapse of the international human rights law issues and the international humanitarian issues. It's a humanitarian context, but we're looking at the human rights of the people in those situations and the consequences of digital technology. And so I would say sort of a do no harm context before we get into overuse of big data.
Yes, Solange.
May I add that because of the infrastructures we are built, they are all dependent and interdependent. So local security, individual security, national security will depend on collective security. And how to be able to enforce this global security is by policy, because alone it's not enough.
Thank you. Kirsten, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of emerging technologies are now being weaponized, and whether existing policies are out of step with the digital realities that we're seeing today.
Okay. The word, I think, weaponization is a really tricky one, and we hear it a lot in this field. I mean, just now we talked about the weaponization of data and exploitation of data. And coming from an arms control background, I kind of take that really seriously. You know, the word weaponization brings to mind, are we talking about a means or are we talking about a method of warfare? And I think we're actually talking about both, and that causes some confusion. In cyber, I could argue that Stuxnet was a cyber weapon, right? It was code designed to do kinetic damage. But most cyber operations aren't that. And so when we talk about weaponization, we need to be very careful, I think. Most cyber operations don't rise to the level of an armed attack. They don't cause kinetic damage necessarily. And that's where we're seeing the most operations and activity going on today, and things like electoral hacking, that sort of thing. So what other kinds of emerging technologies are being weaponized? I would say we have the weaponization of increasingly autonomous technologies in the cyber realm, and that would mean like autonomous hackbacks. DARPA's 2016 Grand Cyber Challenge was exactly about this, increasing autonomy in systems. We have increasing autonomy in conventional weapon systems, which creates new vulnerabilities to cyber, attack, and we have increasing autonomy in military decision aids. So how is the international community dealing with these threats? I would say the short answer is poorly and slowly. Please don't quote me on that. Multilateral discussions on the international security implications of cyber are at a standstill with the failure of these discussions that ended in June this year. And despite some very evident, I would say, overlaps between the discussion on increasingly autonomous conventional weapons, which is happening under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons framework in Geneva, and the cyber domain, there's a lot of overlap. We're talking about appropriate norms. There's overlap in technology. We're talking about how international law applies in all of these. These conversations will not meet. The policy practitioners do not want to mix these two conversations. And that's also very telling and quite disturbing, because we could end up with different legal regimes and different normative frameworks for things that will essentially converge.
Thank you. Yvonne, I think that brings us to something you mentioned to me over email over the last couple of days, which is talking about policy silos. And I think this kind of touches on what you're talking about with having these kind of parallel conversations about what to do next. So can you talk a little bit about the threat of developing within these policy silos, and then maybe for the whole panel, what you see as opportunities to actually break those silos down and create something more cohesive if you think that is the direction we should be headed?
Bad news is that silos will exist, and I hope they won't be strengthened, but in the logic of the system is to create silos. And we should be prepared to deal with silos. The real problem is that internet is such a multidisciplinary field that silos are more problematic than in traditional multilateral fields. Because I'll give you an example of data, which is, for example, which I face on daily basis in Geneva. You have WTO now dealing with data in the context of e-commerce in the preparation for the ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires. Human Rights Council dealing with privacy and data, which is one of the most important tracks currently. ITU dealing with technological aspect of data, International Telecommunication Union. World Health Organization with health data, International Standardization Organization on standards, and I can list about 10 organizations which are basically discussing more or less the same issue from slightly different perspectives, but increasingly adopting sometimes contradictory policies. And it is going to be the major problem. Now we have been trying to break the silos, and after spending at least 2 years of trying to do it, we realized that it is mission impossible. And when you think carefully about it, we as humans tend to socialize in silos. And it's normal to be with people whom you understand, with whom you share the same language. and you develop bonding, you spend long meetings, write together papers, and it's quite normal. What could be, once we establish that this is reality, one thing that we can do is to create so-called boundary spanners. People, institutions, mechanisms that can make bridges between different silos. And at least create alert. Hey guys, while you're discussing in WTO data and e-commerce, be aware of what's going on in the Human Rights Council, which is not happening currently. I would say among more or less all countries, including the major players in this field. Therefore, this is possible, realistic solution to create the boundary spanners institutionally and individually who can play between different silos, cybersecurity, human rights, internet governance, ICANN silos, ITU. I think there are at least 15 to 20 major silos in digital policy currently.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on silos before we move on?
Perhaps it will go through awareness and education, and we should empower people to ask for a good regulation and a better protection in cyberspace and in real life. So, but we need this education, and this is not yet be done.
Thank you.
I would just add, certainly in Silicon Valley, I think there are still pretty strong walls between the technology community and the policy ethics-oriented community. And that's another silo that I've observed many conversations where there's an intentional effort to get a technologist and a policy person to speak, and there's still this missing of each other, notwithstanding good intention. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Same problem here in Silicon Valley.
Here in Silicon Valley, without a doubt.
And perhaps the gaps between generations is a problem, because technology is in the hand of young people and policy is in the head of old people. Work together in the intercultural, intergeneration place or platform to put young and older people from different areas in the same room, in the same table.
And I'm sorry you missed our conversation in the green room before this, but one of the things we were talking about just as a panel was the need to even break down these words, digital policy for a new humanitarianism. Because in each of our areas of practice, even though our practices overlap, we realized we had very different definitions and ideas of what those different terms meant. So trying to get at this idea of silos and how we even get on the same page to be moving the ball forward, I think it's a big first step that needs to happen. Solange, before we move on, I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about how the advancement of artificial intelligence and machine learning is really impacting the way we think about war and our responses to war. It's obviously been a huge topic over the past couple of years.
Yes, as you have already mentioned, information can be a weapon, code can be a weapon, but also vulnerabilities could be a weapon, and that can be used against the owners of the systems. So the automatization is everywhere. It's about the way we are doing war, but it's about the battlefield. And the more we are connected, the more we use ICT technology, the more we produce data, and this data can be used to enforce, improve the soldier capacity, the decision-making process, and so on. So we see that main innovation in technology come from the defense sector. It's true with the internet, with the GPS, and so on. So there is a huge incentive from military side to master this technology and to be the first and the quickest with a more powerful technology. And more we move through technology, less the human have control of this technology. And perhaps one of the main issues that is arise is about the use of drones, of robots that can perhaps take the decision of killing without the intervention of a real people. So that will be a main concern. And we'll see on the internet that cyber attacks are completely automated with a robot. and that will be a fight between robots that attack and between robots that will defend. So it's another dimension that we cannot imagine.
Thank you. So now moving kind of from the state of play to what comes next. Eileen, my next question's for you. There's been quite a bit of talk over the past several months about the potential of creating some kind of digital Geneva Convention. And I know today you were in conversation with Brad Smith of Microsoft and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights around that issue. Would you mind talking a little bit about what that is, why it's being called for now, and kind of what your thoughts are on next steps?
So for me, I would say the positive aspect of that proposal for a digital Geneva Convention is that it puts the focus on the digital security of civilians, consumers, citizens. And in effect, it almost helps create a new paradigm about how we think about digital security, and we're not just protecting the hard stuff, the hard infrastructure, we are thinking about the impact on human beings. And so I think it's really beneficial to try to generate norms that get people to focus on the digital security of people, and in that way it's positive. I think the risk of this conversation is that it could undermine the development of this conceptual conversation we said earlier that is so important, which is to figure out how to take the existing norms under the Geneva Conventions, under international human rights law, and make them, realize them in the global digital ecosystem. And so I don't want to take attention off the existing frameworks we have and making them as real and impactful as possible in this context, even though there is the upside of putting greater focus on civilians and consumers and citizens. But let me also say, I think the real move, it was almost like a rhetorical move rather than a real world geopolitical proposal, because I do not think anybody thinks the prospect of a new treaty in this particular geopolitical context is likely. It's just not going to happen. So in that sense, I think it's really a rhetorical move more than anything else, and in that sense, it's putting the focus on digital security for people.
Thank you. Yvonne, you mentioned in your recent Diplo post that there's a challenge to ensure the right balance between fast technological growth and societal concerns. I was wondering, if, as we continue the conversation around potential policy, what do you see as some of the principles that could be employed to not stifle innovation, but to also make sure that as this sector grows and develops, we're also protecting the most vulnerable among us?
The innovation and the general growth of technology shouldn't definitely harm anyone as much as it is possible. But as we know, there's a famous saying goes that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. Therefore, impact of technology and impact on innovation will always exist. And this is the first to recognize, and I would say it's important to recognize among developers of technology that there is an impact. Impact which exists in various fields, including humanitarian, but I would say broader societal field. And there is one saying that I heard recently that there is a quite considerable part of population in developed countries, which are, if I can paraphrase all saying, are too young to die and too old for digital. Now you have people who are suddenly feeling that they are not part of the changes. They may use the internet, but they are not part of this vibe that exists in society. And that's then this conversation between Bay Area and Geneva area, where there is more understanding about people who can be left behind for different reasons, humanitarian, social, economic. And this is going to be one of the major battles ahead of us, how to ensure that on economic, social, but I would say even let's say, cultural level, people feel that they are part of the society, that they are not left behind because they cannot follow the latest hype or latest rhetorics. And we're speaking here about possibly question of the perception as well. And this element probably contributed to a few of the latest political developments in this country and the United Kingdom, for example. And that reflections should be probably much deeper when we speak about innovation, technological growth, and the impact on society.
So Solange, I know you've been involved as a work area leader of kind of a high-level experts group during the ITU Global Cybersecurity Agenda Initiative in 2007, and that you're still working with Judge Stein Scholberg, chairman of the HLEG, on defending the necessity of an international instrument for peace and security in cyberspace. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts and reflections on this?
Yes, thank you for this kind of question. So first of all, cybersecurity issue arise with the WICIS summit in 2003 and 2005, and then within the Internet Governance Forums. And in 2007, the Secretary General of ITU proposed to a huge initiative, multi-stakeholder initiative about global cybersecurity agenda. And the main topic is to raise awareness at several levels. Should it be at the technical level, organizational level, or it will be about capacity building and international cooperation. And the focus has been done that we need to work together on an international instrument better than the European Convention on Cybercrime, because this European Convention is the only instrument that could be considered as an international one, but it's a regional one. So people outside the process of elaborate this European norm should never follow the European Convention. And the idea was to propose an international treaty on cyberspace, but mainly to perhaps develop the idea of to get an international court of justice to fight or to prosecute major cyber attacks that impact human life, because there's a lot of problem related to the attribution issues, but we can solve it not only from a technical part, but in other domains. And the question is the responsibility of the actors. And I remember 10 years ago when we speak about this kind of approach, Microsoft, for example, but a lot of other participants say we don't want such a convention or such a treaty, such a declaration, whatever you speak about, and we will be free to do whatever we want in cyberspace. We would like to do business, and we don't want regulation for our business. And 10 years after that, we saw some actors, as Microsoft, for example, that pushed on the responsibility problem, and the way they put vulnerabilities on these infrastructures, and to ask for or to present themselves to be as some super hero of cyberspace. They have the idea to do something, but the main problem is that when they do their declaration, it was just after the fact that huge vulnerability have been discovered and used for cyber attack. So I think it's not a loyal approach from Microsoft to propose such an instrument. And perhaps it should be much better that the state or usual regulation people take this problem very at a high level and high degree of necessity. And as you have mentioned previously, it's not a good idea that the private sectors take all the functions of the state and so be substitute to the state decisions. So that's part of the problem.
Thank you. So we're about to open it up to the audience for questions, but before we do, I have a question for anyone who chooses to answer. Who generally should be involved in this conversation on shaping an international process for responding to new threats in cyberspace? Are there particular participants that we're maybe overlooking or who are not part of that conversation and should be? Or do we kind of have that right?
Well, as you know, the multi-stakeholder approach is one of the approaches in the field of digital policy. And it was developed because of the necessity of the way how the internet is organized. And internet has one specificity, internet policy, comparing to all other policy fields like climate change, health, food. In other fields, governments concluded convention or treaty and later on invited civil society and business to join. In internet governance, a policy field was created by technical community and private sector, and government joined it during the World Summit on Information Society. This is uniqueness of this process. But the process has to be multi-stakeholder, with the governments, business sector, as a civil society and users. Technical community should be an important player. Now, as always, devil is in detail, and one has to see what are the respective roles and responsibilities. And governments should definitely have the leading role in public policy. And it's crystallizing more and more in different fora. But this is more or less the landscape when it comes to different actors.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and open it up to the audience? Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
My name is Rebecca from South Africa, and firstly, thank you so much for your contributions. I'm going to start off my question with an example from my own country, where basically our social grant system has been outsourced to an American company for the past couple of years, which was exposed to mining big data from vulnerable people, like pensioners, to the point where up to 70% of the income they were getting from the state was going towards cell phone plans and funeral plans and life policies. Slow. Sorry, I will slow down. Now, something that I've distilled from this conversation is that there is this need to establish some kind of norm on a do no harm approach, whether that be through international law or policy. And my question is in two parts. The first is, how do we achieve that? But the second is, you only have to look at this room and the demographics of this room to then extend that question to how do we ensure that there is representation in who gets to decide what those norms are to be?
And I think that's a part of what I was trying to get to of whose voices are we missing as we think through what our response should be and how do we get active engagement and meaningful participation. So yeah, I would love to hear from any of you who have thoughts on that.
Maybe it's this one. Let me take up the representation one first. I completely agree what was said earlier about the global multi-stakeholder approach to digital policy. I think that's essential. I think it's not only because of the original architecture and community that built the internet, I think it's also because of the fact that it is a global network and resource, and therefore it can't just be based on sovereign nation states defining what happens in their own territory and jurisdiction. That just doesn't cut it because so many things are transborder by nature. In addition, I would say that I think you used the expression, governments are responsible for public policy. That is probably still true, but governments have a relationship and obligations vis-a-vis their citizens. And in a democracy, citizens are sovereign. So very much there's the role of the civil society there. The challenging part, I would say, is that the private sector is playing a much bigger role as it relates to public policy. Let's not even call it public policy, but it's not technically public policy, but its effect is public policy. And that is because the private sector owns, operates, and secures most of the critical internet infrastructure. The private sector is collecting data and mining it for all kinds of purposes without people being fully aware. And also, we had this full conversation today about how to think about the digital information ecosystem and whether that is a public space or a private space. There's a lot of challenging questions that I won't get there, but the private sector on these digital platforms, through their terms of service, their community guidelines, their algorithms, are absolutely affecting the boundaries of freedom of expression and access to information. Those companies have relationships with their consumers. So I think there definitely has to be a triangle between civil society, government, and private sector. I would say civil society should be probably most important rather than less important, and I think it has to be global. How do you create the norms? That's a really challenging subject. I think it's true, it's always been true. How do you create norms? And, the International Human Rights Law Framework, the UN, was founded out of the crisis of World War II. Hopefully it will not take a crisis for us to get some of this right, but unfortunately sometimes that's the case. Did you have something?
Well, a possible comment on here is to rephrase the famous statement that no implementation without representation. And in cyber field, if governments in different parts of society are not represented in the creating of the norms, it can lead to the lack of implementation of these norms. Because cyber field is very specific, it depends on the final individual to the large extent if the norms which are adopted are going to be implemented. Therefore, the question of inclusiveness in policy process is not just a question of values and democratic principles, it's also a very practical, real political issue which can affect directly the question of implementation of adopted norms.
I think another piece that came up earlier was this idea of needing to align incentives, and that we've got to figure out how we shift those incentives, whether they're corporate incentives, government incentives, and better align them with kind of the expectations of society. I see you have the microphone.
Hi, my name is Ilariana, and I sit right now in between the sectors. I come from philanthropy, international development, human rights, transparency, and accountability, and just completed my MBA in Bay Area to get exposed to technology. I am puzzled by this shortage of dialogue between the tech industry and the policymakers, but on the other hand, I also get inspired. Recently, Mark Benioff and the World Economic Forum and UN General Assembly said explicitly that artificial intelligence is a basic human right. I would rephrase that is going to be the future basic human right. If UN Declaration of Human Rights were to be rewritten today, access to internet and access to electricity would be basic human rights. Nowadays, we have countries in which only 11% of populations, of households have access to internet, to electricity. Malawi is one. I would love to hear your thoughts, because I myself puzzled, I cannot have any answer, but how can we figure out really that there is this dialogue that is going to be beneficial to humanity? 12 out of 17 SDGs call explicitly for technology to be the solution to those. Technology means digitization nowadays, most of the cases. How can we ensure that this development is going to be beneficiary and equally distributed through the globe? Or is that too utopian to wish for? I'm sorry for confusion, but I just had to share this with you.
Well, it is already happening by necessity. You probably follow what happened with Uber, banning of Uber in London. And I think the close to 1 million signatures were signed, petition was signed by close to 1 million citizens of London. Therefore, the mayor of London cannot ignore this fact. Interdependence between users, business sector, and governments, which exists in reality, will I think, in optimistic scenario, bring all of those players around the table. Table like this one, round table. I'm sure that Switzerland will offer us this type of table. But necessity, not necessarily the question of values of proclamation, will bring the different players around the table. And it is happening now in London. There will be talks between Mayor of London and Uber on the question of the future of the Uber's status in London. I think it is a very good example, and we'll have more of it.
I have to jump in because I think you highlight probably the biggest issue here that with respect to everything we've talked about, which is on the one hand, there is the imperative that we capitalize on the upside benefits of digital technology for economic development, for humanitarian services, for the exercise of human rights. All of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals are dependent upon the expansion of digital technology. At the same time, all of the risks we've been talking about also flow from digital technology. And if you expand technology into vulnerable populations or even more extensively globally, without having thought through how to adhere to existing values-based human rights principles or humanitarian principles, we're putting people at risk. And so there's the rub. That's the challenge. That's it.
Joe?
Hey, this is so much easier from over here on this side of the table, I have to say. A personal thank you to everyone who is speaking here tonight and spending time with us. We spent a lot of time in the past couple of days together working, trying to put the humanitarian protection question in the middle of the bullseye when it comes to conversations on cybersecurity. For the panelists who were with us in the past 2 days, I just want to ask a general question, which is there anything that excites you or intrigues you about the way that we've had these conversations in the past 2 days that might allow us to move the needle on some of these global conversations on cybersecurity, or provide an entry point for the way that we think about building global policy in cyberspace? So really honing in on, if information is a human right for crisis-affected populations, and we've had, I don't know, 10 different use cases over the past 2 days, does that inspire you in some ways? Does it provide you with some insights as to how to have these conversations when you go back and continue the amazing work that you're doing?
I think that's really a terrific question. And I want to share with something that really struck me, which is way outside my wheelhouse. It has nothing to do with weapons. One of the things that I found really inspiring was listening about all the different ways that relief agencies and humanitarian actors are using digital tools and information to deliver essential services, which is great. What struck me today was I heard somebody talk about, and we know the vulnerabilities and all of that all that data that's generated about vulnerable populations, we know that that's an additional vulnerability, having that much data about them. But what struck me today was when somebody talked about, maybe this is all, we should have this degradation of data. That should be like a policy to make sure that data then disappears when the conflict is over. And part of me was like, wait. What if we could get it right for once? And I'm not an optimistic person. But what if we could get it right? What if we could have strong policies and protections of personal data, that data, starting with vulnerable populations, which would allow, in a post-conflict society, those people to kind of leapfrog towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, what's the irony of the fact that during a crisis time, somebody would have, for example, their medical records digitized, we talked about that, and yet we're saying that when the crisis is over, we're gonna roll that back and destroy that data, or go back to a system where when the humanitarian relief actors leave, we're going to take away some of the benefits of digitization as well. That can't possibly be the way we want this to work. And so part of the question to us, I think, the challenge ahead of us is, how do we get the protection side of the data right, so that those benefits continue and allow us to move towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? So that's way outside my wheelhouse, but that was a takeaway for me.
You have the mic, great.
Yep. So, Jovan, you brought up the sort of quote, technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral, and I'd like to invoke from a sort of similar piece of work, Langdon Winter's famous question, do artifacts have politics? Where he talks about the idea that certain technologies can lend themselves to capture by political actors, but also that certain technologies have sort of intrinsic properties, which they can fundamentally change the sort of social and political order of the day. And I wonder if we're dealing with a set of technologies like that may embody both right now. And Eileen, at the very beginning, you talked about hacking the discourse and protecting democracy. And one of the things that I've seen from many events like this is that a lot of conversations around cybersecurity involve technical solutions to technical problems, but never really discuss the hacking of social systems and human systems. And my question for the panel is really, how do we ensure that the conversation stays on that broader set of problems, especially when we're bringing private sector partners to the table who have a different set of incentives than governments and individuals who really hold liberal democratic norms in high regard. And I think, in particular, that comes to a high regard of importance when we're talking about humanitarian action in vulnerable populations.
Anyone want to respond to that?
If I understood your question correctly, it's related to the way how technology impacts policy making and what we can do in order to implement norms adopted by society. Well, or having some sort of social contract where technology plays the role. It is the key issue. We know that the code can be the law. In the past, and Lessing wrote the book 10 or 15 years ago, but nowadays with algorithms and the development of artificial intelligence, at that time, possibility is becoming a real reality. And I would say that this is one of the core issues in interplay between technology and policy. Can companies hide behind the algorithm? Can they hide behind some sort of abstract technical solutions? Or should they be made accountable for the way how they design their products? And this is one of the issues that Solange mentioned, and in discussion, for example, on Microsoft proposals, we have to speak openly about the question of liabilities. It was mentioned today during our workshops. The approach of many companies that they first release the product and then they provided patches and the other solutions is not sustainable. And the question of liability of the companies for their products in general, but in particular for the software and algorithm, is going to come in the sharper focus of the policy community. It is happening in Europe. There are already quite a few proposals. European Parliament is discussing it. On the national level, there are discussions how to make companies liable for potential damages that could be created by their products, whether they are hardware products or software solutions. And that will be, I think, one of the definitely key issues ahead of us in digital policy.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
I have a mic, but...
Oh, someone has a mic voice.
Peter Eckersley at EFF. So if nation states had an appetite to do more, to protect vulnerable communities against cyber attacks, maybe what they would do is offer salaries and funding that were comparable to the ones offered by the private sector for people who want to do public interest work in this space. At the moment, if you want to defend the internet against being hacked or defend people against being hacked, you go and work for Google or Mozilla because they'll pay you like a decent, in fact, a ridiculous salary to do that kind of work. If you want to do the defense of human systems, there's probably not really anyone who'll pay you to do that, but maybe nation states could be funding more investigative journalists and more defensive human infrastructure to protect the institutions of democracy. And so I guess the question is, do you perceive in Switzerland or elsewhere in the North a willingness to take these problems seriously and say, okay, we're going to turn around and provide funding on the scale that it needs to be provided to actually tackle these problems? Because if not, then it's other actors who are going to shape the space.
Well, one obvious answer is I think the private sector will start paying attention if they fear that they're going to be regulated in ways that are even less effective than that, and would hurt their bottom lines even more than if they were to self-regulate and take these concerns seriously. So, and I think sometimes governments jump into the breach and they don't necessarily fully understand the implications of what they're trying to regulate. So, I'm thinking of the German network enforcement law, which maybe people here are very much in favor of it, but from a human rights point of view, I think it was well-intentioned and it was trying to go after the quality of discourse in the society, but it went after the wrong target. It made the platforms liable for the speech of their users. It handed over judicial authority to the private sector, and it didn't really get at the subject of what are the platforms pushing with their algorithms. What are the things they're intentionally pushing, and instead focused on user-generated content. So I do think the fear of regulation that makes less sense than if they take it seriously at the top is one motivation.
And did I see one more mic back here? Yes, go ahead.
I'm going to project my voice if I can.
Great, okay.
Can you hear me? It's an open question to the panel, but maybe to Madam Yu, who's specialized in AI. Last year, Microsoft released a bot, and it was a complete public embarrassment for the company because very soon after the bot was released, it learned from the interactions that people kind of sent in queries to, and it became neo-Nazi, it became racist, it became a rapist, and it became a public embarrassment. And it suggests that AI responds to the kind of queries and the human interactions that in a sense, it's exposed to. And I'm going somewhere with this. We tend to treat AI as this monolithic entity because it's kind of governed by this fiction of Hollywood. And Hollywood projects us with generalized AI. Specialized AI is in your phone, it's in Siri, it's in Bixby, it's in Google Assistant. We have specialized AI, we rely on it every single day in the palms of our hands. So AI is not this artificial construct that's in the future. My question is quite simply this. Earlier today in the workshop, it was suggested to us that military might is now outsourced to mercenary companies by governments, like Blackwater, for example. I suggest to you, and I submit to you, that AI can do a better job than Blackwater at eliminating a threat based on national security imperatives that are fed to it. If we have the problematique of Blackwater, say in Kabul, Afghanistan, that we countenance today in the international order, what really is so different around AI that can do a better Blackwater than Blackwater? We have Blackwater. We are dealing with mercenaries who are acting on behalf of governments in the national security interest. So if AI can do a better, more efficient and effective job, what is there to suggest to governments like the United States that really it's a bad investment? What are we really concerned about if the violence we fear is actually in our backyards, but we are just blind to it? Thank you very much.
That's a very good question and remarks about artificial intelligence. The most important is to know that we are in interaction with intelligence, artificial intelligence. And we use a lot of systems, as you mentioned, that we doesn't realize that it's about artificial intelligence. First of all, we have to to identify what is artificial, what is real. The second point is about human enhancement. If we can do better things without human, it will be a huge problem in the long term. Because what will make me human is my vulnerability, my weaknesses. And enhancing the human is a philosophical problem. It's the way we would like to evolve in the future. The problem you mentioned is to consider the human as an information system. So what we can do, we collect data about it, and we use this data to improve the human. So that's a lot of problem of cultural problem. And this question raised by the First Lady about culture, about inclusive, it's about globalization. It's the way we develop, and we are not developing at the same speed. We not share the same value. And the problem you mentioned, it's about shared of value, not share of interest. So we have to decide in an ethical way what will be common or not. And so it's a very difficult question. And I will conclude with my main interest or concern. It's about ecology. We are developing a special digital ecology system, but we doesn't master the energy problem. What happens if there is no energy? And what we can do with the digital waste? It's about data, but it's about hardware and software and so on. So we have to discuss in a holistic way, in a transdisciplinary way, to try to find the better answer for this question. And first of all, it's about silo. It's about silo in education. It's about silo in research also. And we have to educate people. And perhaps the solution will come from people who ask for something special. We are just consumers. We consume. We doesn't use our intelligence to know if it's useful or not useful. And how in the long term this technology will affect humanity. So that's a lot of questions. And that's a good place here to discuss these issues.
Well, this is obviously the very beginning of a conversation that needs a lot more work, but unfortunately, even though this is the beginning for this, we've come to the end of our time. So I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight, and please join me in thanking our panel.
A big thank you once more to this fantastic panel and your expertise. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. We really appreciate it. So, as has been suggested, the road to responsible digital governance and policy, especially in the humanitarian sphere, is long and it is dark and it is uphill. But what if we get it right? There is hope. There's hope by the fact that experts like these, like all of us in the room, are getting together and thinking about it. And I really do believe, if the last 2 days have taught us anything, that a road towards a more responsible and sustainable future leads through more attention to humanitarian action in this field. So thank you for joining us. Benjamin, do you want to lead us out?
Oh, just a quick note. Thank you very much to the workshop participants. They came from Holland, from Sri Lanka, from the East Coast, from the West Coast. It was great to have you here. Thank you for this very productive 2 days, and also to the entire Swissnex team, which was behind the scenes, especially Margot, who made that possible. Thank you very much.
Now enjoy some Egyptian dinner, and please have a drink with us. Ciao.